Ann Pettifor, welcome to Silver Eels. You're originally from South Africa, you've lived in Britain, and you have been a champion of the poor in the sense that you have fought for debt relief. You had a famous effort some years ago called Jubilee 2000.
That's
and
right, yes.
It attracted a lot of celebrities, Bono and others. Yes. But I'd like you to tell me just a bit about yourself, sort of to place you in where you stand in the world.
Yes, well, I was born in South Africa. I grew up in the shadow of a gold mine, the gold which underpinned the Bretton Woods system of the post-war period. And I lived there and then went to university there. And then I was very unhappy with apartheid, but I didn't want to go to Robben Island, so I left. And I spent the last 40 years in Britain. I spent some time in Tanzania in the early 70s, which was a formative period for me. But I've been here since then.
You're here to discuss basically how the current crisis will affect African countries. Just let's start off with that shortly.
Yes, I mean, the point is that we now are going through, in my view, a period of very deep recession. There's great debate whether to call it the Great Recession or the Great Depression. Nobody wants to use depression. The word depression was used in the 1930s to avoid other words, you know. But what we cannot avoid is this is the most synchronized global financial crisis in history. We've never been so synchronized as a global economy. And therefore the shocks travel across the world much more quickly than they did before, and they will hurt the poorest and the most vulnerable the most. You know, we will cut aid flows. Already yesterday the United States announced cuts in the amount of money going towards financing AIDS, and so people dying of AIDS in Africa are going to be denied medicines and things. And they're the most vulnerable of all. So this sort of thing is going to happen and get worse as a result of this crisis.
So these are people who did not benefit from the good times, but they will suffer from the...
They're totally innocent. And I mean, there are innocents in Iceland, there are innocents in Britain, there are innocents in the United States. People who played no part in this at all, carried on doing their work, daily basis, did their thing, did the proper thing, saved money, worked hard, and, you know, they are victims.
You actually predicted the crisis, the debt crisis, in 2003, and then in 2006 you wrote a book actually about the coming crisis.
Yes. In 2003, I'd been around Africa. I'd campaigned to get 42 countries were relieved of something like 80 to 90 billion dollars of debt as part of our campaign. But then I'd been in Southeast Asia in ' for that crisis, and I'd been in Argentina in 2001 for the Argentina crisis. So by then I thought I could see how these crises unraveled. But when I started totting up the numbers, I thought, well, the debt here is tiny compared to the debt in my country, Britain, and in the United States. So we know, and the imbalances are very, very grave. And so that it was obvious to me. So in 2003, I wrote a book called The Real World Economic Outlook, this is what it's really like. Of course, it was ignored.
Yes.
And then in 2006, I wrote a book with a chapter on Iceland, actually, in which I said Iceland was like the butterfly's wing. You know, it was the first flutter, the March 2006 crisis here was the first flutter of the butterfly's wing, which then causes, you know, volcanoes elsewhere. And sure enough, it was.
Yes.
But in May 2006, the IMF said, no, the global economy has never been in better condition than it is now. So it was very hard, you know. I mean, to work at the IMF, you have to have 2 PhDs, not 1. And humble people like me, you know, can't compete with that kind of thing. So we were ignored, and they were believed.
So they said they ignored you, and they said you didn't know what you were talking about.
I didn't know what I was talking about. And so, but the awful tragedy for me is that, you know, ordinary investors, ordinary people putting their pension funds money away or investing in pension funds, did believe them, you know. And so when British professors, one of the things I'm most angry about Iceland is that the economics profession colluded, if you like, with the finance sector in the delusion that this was a party that could go on forever. So, you know, there were British economic professors, and indeed the president of the Royal Economic Society in Britain wrote a letter in the Financial Times in July 2008 refuting an earlier letter in which a professor had said Iceland was in trouble. And he said, not at all, far from it. And he co-signed this with an Icelandic professor. And as a result, ordinary people in Britain, never mind in Iceland, you know, kept putting their money in the banks, kept investing in this bubble. And that I find is criminal, in my view.
You find it criminal?
I find it criminal because I think if you are a professor of economics, if you're in that privileged position, if you have access to data, if you get behind the scenes of banks, you have a duty to tell the truth of what's really going on. And I think there's been a lot of collusion and there's been a lot of, well, very bad economics is all I can say. Really.
But in hindsight, all of this seems to be a bit mad. It was not only, I think you've used the word unbalanced, unfair and unsustainable.
Yes.
And a bit mad as well.
Crazy.
Yes.
Absolutely crazy. But very destructive too, because look what is being destroyed, you know. People's livelihoods are being destroyed, you know. Productive industries are being destroyed. What upsets me about the way the politicians are approaching the crisis now is they're focusing on the banks. Now, the banks don't produce a thing. The banks are mere facilitators. They simply are they just handle the tokens that go between you and I.
Yes.
We do the work.
Yes.
The people doing the real work, the businesses, and I don't mean labourers just here, I mean corporates, are the ones, you know, interest rates for companies in Britain and the United States are at extraordinarily high rates. The base rate is 0.5%, but if you want to borrow to invest, for example, in green technology in the United States or wherever, you're paying 18-20%. It's very, very high. And the governments are not paying attention to that. They're worrying about the banks. And whereas what we need to worry about is our corporate sector and our productive sector.
You have said that America has been hijacked by the banks, that America is bank-owned.
It's a bank-owned state, is what I said. It's not a state-owned bank, it's a bank-owned state.
Yes.
There's been the biggest heist in history. I mean, and the money is unbelievable. And why have they gone there? Well, because, you remember, there was an old bank robber used to say, why do you rob the bank? And he said, well, because that's where the money is. Where is the money? The money is in the state. Here in Iceland, the money is in the government. You know, it's people, the government's using money that comes in form of taxes and pension funds, and it's sitting there, and the banks are going after it. It is a heist, you know. And the fact is that we need to salvage the banks because we do need to keep the financial system going. We need to protect people's depositors. Yeah. But in the 1930s, Roosevelt, the first thing he did was to restructure the banks. He said, right, we must protect deposits, but we're going to separate out that gambling end of the bank, you know, the so-called financial intermediaries that do speculation and that invest and so on. We keep that separate. That was the Glass-Steagall Act. And he did that within 3 days, if you like, of the anger that erupted over the banks. But currently the Obama administration is not restructuring. And instead the banks are just standing at the door saying, we want more, we want more.
They're pumping money into the banks,
and
so you think we need a new system?
Absolutely. We need to restructure the banks. We need to make them smaller. We need to downsize everything. We need to downsize the financial system. It's as if you had a restaurant feeding, you know, an Icelandic restaurant feeding the whole of Britain and Holland in food. It's not sustainable. You can't do it. You need to have more local banks, more banks that understand in this part of the world what is happening to business there, whether or not these people are trustworthy, whether or not they really are making those rates of returns. If I sit here in Iceland and I'm lending money to someone in Britain and I have no idea whether or not that really is a business with a rate of return, I make errors. It's natural. So we need to downsize the banks, restructure them.
Of course,
I don't believe necessarily that we should nationalise them, by the way.
No.
Because, you know, I don't think governments can run banks. But governments have to regulate them, and they have to control the way in which banks create credit.
So we need earlier you mentioned the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah.
Do we need a second Bretton Woods?
Definitely we need a Bretton Woods system. We need a new global system where we manage the imbalances in the world. Because the other thing, which, you know, the G20 met in London a few weeks ago, big furore, you know, lots of pictures and posing and lots of spinning of wonderful tales and things. But they didn't address the fact that the United States has got a massive deficit, and so has Britain, and China has a massive surplus. Yes. And this is leading to global imbalances. And we haven't managed those, but we have to manage those balances. Between 1945 and 1971, we lived through what the economists called a golden age. Yes. And that was because we managed balances. We managed trade, and we managed capital flows, and we managed interest rates. And we said, if you manage all of those things, business thrives. And sure enough, it did. And then came along 71 Nixon and co, and they said, no, let the banks run the economy, let the finance sector run the global economy.
Yeah.
Let us privatize the financial sector and let them run it. And look what we have. You know, we have high interest rates, we have financial crises, and now we have destruction of value.
And globalization has been a mess.
Terrible mess. It's, you know, it's ended up. Lots of people have got very rich.
Yes.
Let's not beat about the bush here.
Yeah.
Lots of people have got extraordinarily rich on the back of it, and a lot of people have been lifted up by trade and so on, and people have been able to borrow, and that's enabled them to do up their houses and everything. But we now are going to go through a period of terrible destruction, and I don't know whether or not, personally, I don't think that the benefits will outweigh the costs.
But money and credit, it's a mysterious phenomenon. It's the way the banks have been run, really sort of printing money, and this touches on of course, on the subject of debt relief.
Yeah, I mean,
what is a real economy? And what is
exactly. I think, you know, one of my missions is to help people understand what money is and what credit is, you know, because what the banks do is a kind of magic. And when people say to me, no, they take my savings and they use my savings to lend to somebody else, it's rubbish. They enter a number into a ledger, and you know the effort of that is nil, and the cost of it is nil, and then they charge you rate of interest on it. Of course, they like to have collateral against that loan.
Yeah.
That they have. So your property or whatever is the collateral. But that's all it is. They have no savings in the bank. They have no money in the vaults. You know. So it's an effortless and a costless activity from which they make enormous sums of money. But that is why we have to regulate them. If we're going to give them the power to create money, it must be regulated. But I think once we understand that, because, you know, they don't print money. No. The central bank prints money. Yeah. But if you think about your own, the way you handle money, how much printed money and minted coins do you carry of your total money? You only carry about 2%. To go with a coin machine or to play. Yeah. But most of your money is a bank transfer, internet transfer. You know, you never see it. You never touch it. It doesn't exist. It's an abstract concept.
Yes.
And for that, the banks get paid a lot of money.
Yes.
So I think, you know, we need to come back to... They're not printing money. Printed money is now a tiny proportion of the money in the global economy. Yeah. They are just entering a number into a ledger. And in the case of the central banks, they've entered something like $7 trillion into a ledger, and they've given it to the banks across the world since the crisis began in August 2007. $7 trillion? What could we do with $7 trillion? And we've been told no. If you ask them, did you raise this from the taxpayers? They say, no. It just fell out from the blue sky. Now, if I want $7 trillion to help Africa or Latin America, or to clean up the oceans, or to do something about the atmosphere, the banks will say, no, that's terribly hard. You know? And I think we, the citizens, have to come to an understanding of what's going on here. And when we understand it, we have to demand more of our banks.
But a key factor in the system is that everybody actually borrows money and it's credit. And now... for example, in Iceland and in other countries, people are talking about the necessity of debt relief, that people have just borrowed so much money that they will not be able to pay it back. And, of course, governments as well.
Yes.
Yeah. What is your point on that?
Well, the point is this, that, you know, there are constraints. The banks can enter a number into the ledger. Without any effort, they can create credit. But there's a limit. And the limit is the amount of it that can be repaid. And the limit is how much labour you and I can perform to repay that debt. You know? And there's a limit to that. How many cod do we have to fish out of the sea to repay the debt? There's a limit to that. And the banks did not understand that limit until they'd gone well over it. And when you are well over it, you can't go on plundering the sea of cod. No. You have to write off some debt. You have to say, sorry, the bank's made a huge mess here. It just has to be written off. That's why we have bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy law is the most civilized thing. It's the most wonderful invention of an advanced civilization. It says that when banks behave stupidly and overlend, the debt is not repayable. You can bankrupt a company, you can bankrupt a country, you can destroy it to get your money back. But funnily enough, when you destroy the company, it doesn't pay back. Or Or you can write off the debt and return that company to the real economy to get them active again, and then you get some money back into the economy. So that's the choice. And the wonderful thing about bankruptcy law is that it recognizes that debt has become unpayable, and you must then at some point write it off and start again.
Instead of becoming a slave
or dying as a slave, yeah, exactly. Because what can a slave do? What can a starved, weak, impoverished slave do that a healthy, vigorous, well-fed man, can do? It's the difference. And so you can choose to destroy that economic capacity, or you can write off the debt and then revive the economic capacity. That's the choice.
So what is your take on the Icelandic situation?
Well, I have to say that, I think it's tragic, really. I'm very sad about it. I think that the IMF is culpable. I see the IMF coming here. I hear from the government that the IMF is being quite resilient. It's been quite cooperative, and I should hope so. Iceland is a product of IMF policies. Iceland is a product of the ideology that dominated the IMF from 1970s onwards. And I should jolly well hope that the IMF comes here and helps to repair this. My worry is that the cost that the IMF is asking for is too high for Icelandic people. 18%, I believe the interest rates come down to 15% now. That is an extraordinary rate of interest. It's a crippling rate of interest. It's going to starve the slave again.
Yes.
It's not doing the thing that we asked it to do. Now, interestingly, the United States is nearly bankrupt. Britain is nearly bankrupt. What does our bank do? It lowers interest rates to naught.
Yeah.
They're naught. Why? Because they recognize that to revive the body of this economy that is deflating and dying, to pump life into that economy, you have to lower interest rates. Why is Iceland paying 15%? Why is it different here? Now there's the issues around the Icelandic currency and so on, and restabilizing the currency. And I'm not trying to pretend that it's not a complex thing to solve. But I think what is happening here is that the banks made the mess. The IMF is giving money in order to bail out the banks to an extent, including British banks. The British taxpayer is lending money to the Icelandic taxpayer in order to pay back the British taxpayer depositors that took out money into. We're going around the way where ultimately taxpayers, British or Icelandic, are bailing out a financial sector which is, where are they? Scot-free.
Yes.
Scot-free. Who's in jail because of this? Not a single person. Who has been charged because of this? Who's been found guilty of bankrupting the Icelandic economy? If a company director did this, ran away with the money, you'd have him back, wouldn't you, as shareholders, and you would demand something to be done. And the ones who are culpable are not just the bankers, because the bankers behaved really stupidly, but it's those that encourage them. And for me, it's the economics profession. The economics profession is very culpable, and it has to clean out itself. It's clean out the Augean stables, if you like, of the economics profession, and say, look, we have to look at this model of economics that has developed since the 1970s, which the IMF is now using as its model, which is not, in my view, it doesn't relate to how credit and money is created.
So is it an option for Iceland and for the Icelandic people not to pay?
Well, I'm not going to encourage that, but there comes a point when you can say, sorry, but I can't pay. Why did you gamble in my country's bank? It was a private bank after all. Why must I bail out, And, the question is, at what point do the Icelandic people say the cost to the innocence is too high?
How far if we come down to the individual? How far can we go in forcing the individual to pay back their loans, which are with high interest rates, and they're indexed as well? We have this system of indexation in Iceland.
Right, of course. So they can. Well, you can't force people, but people are on the whole willing to pay. They don't want the stigma of not paying their debts. But what begins to happen is that the social contract in society breaks down, and this is happening in the United States. So the contract is this: I will pay my debts if you, the government and the economy, make sure that I get paid a decent wage, an income. If I don't get that, then I'm not going to pay my debts. So what you have in the United States at the moment is where people can't pay their mortgages. So they've lost their jobs, they can't pay. They put the keys into an envelope and they post it to the estate agent.
Yes.
It's called jingle mail. The agent gets this jingle mail. Now what's breaking down there is a contract between society, between one part of society and another part of society. And when that contract breaks down, it's bad for the banks and it's bad for society. But it will break down if you push people to those limits. So much better to do it in an orderly way, to say, look, people can only pay so much of their income.
Yes.
They can't be expected to starve. And if they can't pay that, then let's rearrange the bankruptcy law and extend the terms of the loan, lower the rates of interest. Let's force the banks to take some losses and to make this payable. Otherwise, we break down this social contract. And when that happens, God help us all.
Yes.
Nobody can then honour contracts.
To finish, you are one of the authors of a report called calling for a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Because we don't face just a financial crisis. We face a triple crisis. It's the financial crisis, but we face an energy crisis. Now, what I find fascinating about Iceland is that you are the most energy sustainable country in the world with geothermal energy. But there's an environmental crisis out there. The Arctic is melting, and all those will have impacts on Iceland, as well as what's happening to biodiversity and so on. And then we face, climate change. So it's environmental and climate change. It's energy, climate change, and financial. And we're going to have to look at all three of these crises. We can't parcel them up and say, we'll deal with this one and we'll wait to deal with that one later. And so what we're saying is, but that's a great opportunity. It gives us a chance because we have to reconfigure our world, and let's reconfigure it to make it sustainable. And furthermore, let's, in doing so, create employment. In my country, our houses, Victorian houses, are leaky. We need to seal them, to make them draft-proof. That requires intense, labour-intensive work. We need all kinds of alternatives energies and so on. And not just in Britain, but in Africa and elsewhere. So we can begin to look at these renewable energy sources and also at the same time generate jobs by doing that. But to do that, we have to fix the financial system so we get the money to do that.
But this will not happen in a speculative economy.
It won't happen.
A speculative economy is not interested in things like that.
No, exactly. No. So that's why we have to reconfigure the financial system as well. And that was my contribution to the report, was to say, let's look at the way we reconstruct the financial system to finance the way we address these three challenges.
So, Anne Pettifor, thank you very much for being on Silver Ales.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.